Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome all viewers. So I'm recording this on September 12th, 2021, meaning that yesterday marked 20 years since the tragedy that occurred on September 11th, 2001. And as a result, there were a lot of discussions and conversations and videos lately talking about what happened. But there was one topic in particular that I thought was important to expound upon, and that's why I'm recording this video. And that topic had to do with how Islam was basically preached differently before 9/11, but then after 9/11, the types of speeches that were given, khutbahs, just a lot of the rhetoric and da'wah and way Islam was discussed was it was changed. It was noticeably different. Now, I myself didn't embrace Islam. I was not a Muslim until about 7 years after 9/11 happened. But I was 15 years old on September 11th, 2001. So I clearly remember what happened and how much things changed. But I didn't know any Muslims. So I really didn't even know about Islam until 7 years later. But specifically, I wanted to share my experience as a non-Muslim at that time, because there are adults now who were not even born when 9/11 happened, which is, subhanAllah, time flies. It makes you feel kind of old, but that's the reality. So it is something that I think the younger crowd needs to be aware of, because it's history that was not that long ago, and it still affects us today as Muslims in the West and Muslims around the world. So much happened. And also, I think it's a good reminder, because a lot of these things I forgot. So without further ado, I was 15 years old, and I remember I was in high school. I was in 10th grade, and I was in science class, and there was an announcement saying that we were going to be let out early. And everyone was confused, like, what do you mean we're getting out early? And somehow word spread that there was this, some sort of attack on the World Trade Centers, so we were going to be able to go home. Now, the reason our high school in particular got to go home was because it was on an army base. I grew up on Fort Meade, which is in Maryland, and on Fort Meade there is the NSA. So they said, this they might try to attack Fort Meade or NSA, or something might happen. So we got out of school early that day, and as soon as we got home, it was just all over the news. Now remember, 2001, this was before smartphones. The news obviously was a major source of where we got our information, and it was just nonstop on the news, showing images of the towers falling, the planes crashing into the buildings, and tragedy just nonstop. And you could see on the pain on everyone's faces, and like the news anchors, and how distraught everyone was. And there was just this feeling across the country of, like, I don't even know how to describe it, but this was like, this sort of changed everything. I actually had a teacher in college about 6 years later who, she viewed the world, actually, she viewed history as pre 9/11 and post 9/11. That's how powerful that event was, and how much things changed for people. And she was a non-Muslim, so I can only imagine and hear from Muslims regarding their experiences. So one of the main ways that this changed, now I can't speak for other people, but me going to high school on a military base, I grew up on Fort Meade, but by the time I was in high school, we moved just outside of Fort Meade. So I used to have to drive a few minutes to get on to the military base and then go to school. And up until 9/11, 2001, you could come and go freely. There were no gates, there were no guards. You could go on base, off base. It was just sort of like driving through another neighborhood. But literally the next day we started going to school. there's a gate up. There were armed guards. They would actually search our cars. We would have to pull over, show our IDs, pop our trunks. This happened immediately after 9/11. So as you can see, I mean, this all of this going on, the constant bombardment of the imagery on the news, and we were off school the next day. Now our cars are being searched. I mean, it changed. It just changed everything, and it was unavoidable. And even at school, even though I went to school on a military base, it wasn't like how some people who didn't grow up in the military or coming from a military background might think, that it's very strict. No, I mean, it was a public school. People who even lived off base, didn't have family in the military, would go to the school. But I remember there was this student who, right after 9/11 happened, he was walking around school with an American flag, which was like unheard of, but that was just the vibe at the time. Like he was walking around with like this real legit huge heavy, like with like a golden eagle on it type of flag. I mean, it really did sort of bring Americans together, because we felt like there was an attack on us. You had like Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda and these groups being portrayed as, these terrorists, they attacked us. So that was what was in the air. I wasn't like this real academic, studious person who knew about politics or was interested in foreign policy. I didn't know about religion. I didn't know any Muslims at the time. But one thing that did happen is, no doubt everyone knew the word Islam. They knew that it was a religion. They knew that Islam and Muslims, radical Islam and extremist Muslims, were being blamed for 9/11. So prior to that, I never thought about Islam or Muslims. I think the only sort of brief interactions here and there I had with Islam, even as a concept, was maybe hearing the word Allah used by somebody, or the name Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Like, what kind of name is that? Oh, that's like a Muslim name. But it really didn't go beyond that. But now Islam is in everybody's vocabulary, and the first thing we think about is this terrorist attack. We think about all this that has been going on. We think about this imagery of the towers falling and the tragedy, the devastation, and you start seeing all these pictures of like scary terrorists covering their faces with these machine guns and these big beards and turbans, and that is just what the American people were bombarded with nonstop. And then I remember George Bush, and it's not that he was this respected like intellectual president or anything like that, but due to the situation, I just remember him giving a speech, and it's like everyone, they just had some sort of attachment to like the country, and you had this sort of newfound respect for the president, even if beforehand you didn't. And it was all attached to this tragedy, and this tragedy was constantly being attached to Islam and Muslims. So during this time, again, me being a teenager, just consumed in my own selfish desires in life, I didn't really pay too much attention to like really diving into all of the specifics about what was going on overseas or Islam or Muslims or anything like that. But I do remember what I did come across. I do remember seeing on the internet, before social media, it was like discussion boards and chat rooms and stuff like that. From what I remember being exposed to during this time, there was some website that would just quote certain passages of the Quran about killing the disbelievers, and people talking about how these guys, like, they're dangerous, and they want to kill us and kill anyone who isn't Muslim and all this. So that was basically as deep as I looked into it. And one of the reasons I'm sharing this is to let you know, I mean, this isn't like an isolated case for me. I'm sure countless Americans, countless people around the world had a similar experience. This is what they knew about Islam. This is how Islam was introduced to them. And although I admittedly did a very shallow job regarding researching Islam, there are other people who they did more research. I mean, they read books. There were certain lecturers that came to educate others about Islam and Muslims. Government agencies would hire people to come and inform their employees, or even soldiers in the military about Islam and about Muslims. And unfortunately, a lot of what people got at that time, it was from the perspective of Islamophobes. I don't want to dignify or promote them by mentioning their names, but they are well-known people who they have written books, they've made entire careers out of trying to convince people that the quote-unquote version or sect of Islam that terrorist groups preach and propagate is actual true Islam. Now I can say, after having studied and practiced Islam for over a decade, that it's well known you have these astray, deviant groups and sects. This is something that isn't new. It's been around for hundreds of years, and Islam has a very academic, intellectual history where the preserved understanding of the divine revelation has been passed down and explained, and deviant groups have been refuted. But looking back now, I can see the majority of the world that was now being introduced to Islam for the first time at a real significant level, they were being introduced to it through a deviant group, through an incorrect understanding. And there were non-Muslims who were actually even making careers out of propagating that. However, when you learn Islam properly from the scholars who are upon the Quran and Sunnah, they refute these deviant groups. But such scholars weren't being given the major platforms to explain things. And of course, there are certain people who benefit from that. They can use the idea of Islam itself being a terrorist religion to their advantage. But to sort of wrap things up, I want us to consider what Muslims were going through at this time, without even getting into some of the specifics regarding laws being passed, people being detained. Just imagine what it must have felt like seeing all this propaganda spreading and then being a Muslim, surrounded by people who have been fed that propaganda. Several brothers told me about how they were treated during that time, even being in high school, about how people would come to them and say, "Why do you guys hate us?" I can only imagine how much pressure Muslims felt to portray themselves as peaceful. And this is sort of what one of the brothers had mentioned regarding how da'wah, how inviting people to Islam and how giving lectures really changed after 9/11, because there's this hyper awareness of people looking at you like you're a terrorist. And even though Islam isn't a terrorist religion, we don't believe in the deviant sects that go to these extremes, but still people will overcompensate. Some people must have felt so much pressure that they couldn't handle it. They didn't know how to deal with it. Not everybody, but I'm sure a lot of people just wanted to be accepted. And a lot of people probably spoke about the religion without even having a lot of knowledge. And there are certain factions that can also use this to their advantage, because if Muslims are going to really try to overcompensate and change their religion because they feel so much pressure and they're so scared to be labeled this or that, then there are powers that be that can use that to their advantage and try to reform Islam, try to change Islam to suit them. So I just wanted to share some of that information. I also forgot to mention about the airports and about TSA, because flying has become so much more popular and common. And the fact that we go through so much security, I'm sure a huge amount of us attribute that to 9/11, because that's when some of these changes started to take place. So that really was a huge event, and so many changes happened, and there are a lot of things that still remind us of what happened. And many people still attach that to Islam. So it played, and still to this day plays, a major role regarding how so many people look at the religion of Islam and Muslims. I will say those feelings that people had when 9/11 first happened definitely has died down. I think most people understand that there are radical factions of all types of different communities, not just Muslims. And that being the case, I encourage myself and other Muslims to be aware of how people view us and try to have wisdom when we are informing others about Islam. However, we have to be balanced. We should not try to change our religion to please people. We should tell them the truth about Islam. Islam is not a terrorist religion, but that doesn't mean people are going to love every single thing about Islam. But that's for them to decide. Islam is balanced. Its teachings are balanced, and the way that we practice it should be with balance. Allah knows best. Thank you for watching. Let me know what you think in the comments. Jazakumullahu khairan. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.